Report with Combat Press is here. I am your host, Riley Contek. Unfortunately, our normal host, Eric Reinert, has stepped away from the MMA writing game for a little bit, so in his absence, the show must go on. I would like to proudly introduce our new co-host, Matt Wiggins from Florida. Matt, how's it going tonight?
Pretty good. Quiggins with a Q.
Quiggins with a Q.
Yes.
You a Northeastern guy?
No, I'm actually born and raised in Florida.
Oh, okay. I was thinking you were one of those Irish guys from the Northeast that moved down to Florida.
Yeah, the beard usually gives that away.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I'm trying to grow a little bit of a beard myself, but obviously it's not nearly as manly as yours. On tonight's show, we are gonna have me try out the actual hosting gig duties. That was usually Eric's job, but we'll see how I do with it today. We will talk about the past weekend. On Saturday, the UFC came live from Sweden with UFC on Fox 14, so we will talk about that. We will also talk about the upcoming UFC this weekend, UFC 183, taking place from Las Vegas and headlining between former middleweight champion Anderson Silva and former Strikeforce welterweight champion Nick Diaz. We'll also talk about a few other things, including the Invicta card that was announced, as well as our new segment, the Regional Promotion of the Week, in which we'll talk about CES 27 in the East. But to start things off here, we had UFC on Fox 14 on Saturday night, came live from Sweden. And if you didn't know, it actually came in American primetime hours, meaning that the card actually started around 2 or 3 in the morning in Sweden, meaning that the Swedes had a very late night. Matt, what were your thoughts on that in terms of how late it started and how surprisingly packed the arena was?
Well, I mean, having, a main card guy like Alexander Gustafsson, the hometown hero, and really, playing off of that, I really think it didn't matter what time of the day it was, they would have been there. And really, I mean, for us in, America, the card placement as far as timing was perfect. Unfortunately for them, like you said, it was 3, 4 in the morning sometimes, when the main card was getting ahead. So, those fans are just diehard and they really want to show their support for their hometown hero, so to speak.
Yeah, I agree. I was really impressed with, it was packed. I think they said there was like over 20 some thousand people that were there, which was pretty impressive, especially for a show that late. I always make the joke. I got a buddy from Sweden, and they like to party a little bit. So maybe staying up that late in the morning wasn't as big of a deal as we might have thinking it was. But props for them for being boisterous the whole night, especially considering the Swedish guys didn't do too well on the card, which kind of leads us into our first fight that we're going to talk about. The main event was a light heavyweight title contender bout between Alexander Gustafsson, the hometown boy, and generally coming into this fight considered the second best light heavyweight in the world at this point, taking on American challenger and really just an all-around guy who's been what we can consider just making a complete career turnaround in Anthony Johnson. And you saw the result, and the career turnaround continued as Anthony Johnson knocked out Alexander Gustafsson relatively quickly in this fight and shocking the Swedish fans. What are your thoughts on that, Matt?
Well, I mean, it was pretty interesting because, I will say this, and someone else had pointed this out to me too. Alex did not look like he was in the same shape he was as when he fought John Jones. I don't want to say he looked out of shape. He just did not look as defined as he was last time. I don't know if there was something in training. I don't know if he underestimated Johnson. I just know that Johnson did what everyone needed to do with, Gustafsson. He cut off the cage and he made him go through him. And it was really, interesting to see. Now people are putting up the video about, the headbutt and things like that. Controversy from top to bottom, it seems like on that main card, as far as stoppages, too soon and too late. But it was just really interesting to see, Johnson shine as he has, because I can't believe this guy used to make 170, or at least attempt to make 170.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you brought up the cutting off the cage and the footwork. Yeah, I think that's the best I've ever seen Anthony Johnson in terms of footwork and actually working the cage. Because we always think of him as this power striker guy with great power and awesome kicks, but he was never really known as the technically sound guy that was using his footwork and setting things up by cutting the cage off, like you were saying, with a guy like Gustafsson, who you absolutely have to do that with.
Yeah, and nobody has done really up to that point.
Oh, absolutely, and you're right, and even John Jones didn't do it really, and and the way Anthony Johnson did it was almost so brilliant that it was just like it wasn't the same Anthony Johnson we're used to. He was kind of a technical brawler, a guy that's just going to stand in the pocket and beat you up, even though he does have good technique and good form. So it was kind of a different Anthony Johnson, in my opinion, that we saw. And it's an Anthony Johnson that's going to be a very dangerous guy going down the stretch if he continues to fight that way. So obviously we talk about Gustafsson and Johnson's fight and Johnson getting the win. They were basically fighting to fight John Jones. I guess the main question is here, obviously John Jones is probably the best pound-for-pound fighter in the world. Can you see any scenario where Anthony Johnson defeats him?
Well, absolutely. That's why we love MMA, and that's why we cover this sport, because, as we know and we've seen in, especially in the past few years, specifically with Anderson Silva, that if there's a will, there's a way. If there's a way to beat him, do I see that happening anytime soon? No. I mean, I think Johnson possesses, again, every fighter that John's ever fought, that John Jones has fought, somebody brings up something different. He's the best wrestler he's ever fought. He's the best technical striker. He's the tallest fighter he's ever fought. And every time he comes out on top, and, with the exception of the Gustafsson fight, he comes out on top with relative ease. Mm-hmm. And as far as the pound for pound, I actually had a conversation about this the other day, so it works. And someone was arguing, as long as Anderson did reign, if you look at the level of talent that he fought compared to what Jones has had to fight, I would say John is the pound for pound, and he's going to stay that way for a while if he keeps fighting the way he is.
Yeah, definitely, and I agree with you. I think Anderson Silva is undoubtedly, if not the best fighter of all time, one of the best fighters of all time.
Agreed.
But
yeah.
You take a look at his resume. You're absolutely right, and I've had this conversation with Eric Reinert before, who was the former host of the show. That John Jones's resume is quickly becoming easily the best in the history of mixed martial arts. You talk about a guy like Fedor, who took on some tough guys, who also did not take on some tough guys in the same sentence. And then you have Anderson, who's very similar to Fedor in that matter, and that he's taken on some very, very tough guys. A prime Rich Franklin, Vitor Belfort when he in the beginning of his resurgence of his career. But he's also taken on guys like a very unmotivated looking Talis Ladius. A very overmatched Damian Maia.
And that was even a joke, watching that fight. There's never a time in a Jones fight where he's not fighting, at least in my opinion.
Right.
And, Anderson's got his antics, and that's, untimely led to his downfall.
Totally, and yeah, and that's a great point too. Right. I think Johnson has a puncher's chance, but Johnson's been exposed by wrestlers in the past, and in my opinion, there's no better MMA wrestler outside of maybe George St. Pierre in his prime than John Jones, the way in which he uses it, because he has all those physical gifts and he has the length and he has the wrestling background. So that's why I don't think that Johnson's going to win the fight, but he should make it interesting just based on Jones has been hurt before, and a lot of people realize this. He's been hurt by punches before, and I don't think he's fought a guy who punches harder than Anthony Johnson. So that's kind of the thing there.
It showed in that the Machida fight, was really the first time that we saw John got hit. And we saw what he did to adjust, and with everything he threw after that, he made sure that it was, I hate using the bad intentions, but he made sure it counted. Right. He made sure, because as soon as he cut Leota's entire, demeanor changed, his whole game plan changed, and within 2 minutes after that, fight was over. So
yeah, absolutely.
I agree that Johnson is probably going to have the strongest power, and as far as him being exposed by wrestlers, Phil Davis was a good test for him, being that Phil Davis is as accomplished as he is, and he didn't have a problem with him at all. So maybe this, him being at this heavier weight, he's learned to stick down on that base and really prevent the takedown or make sure that that's not going to be an issue. But he's also going to be fighting John Jones, who is going to probably take him down whether he wants him to or not. So.
Right, and that's a great point. The Phil Davis fight, but Jones is a Phil Davis type wrestler with striking and jiu-jitsu. So moving forward, we went to the co-main event. It was a relatively quick one. It was also in the light heavyweight. It was in the middleweight division. It featured Pride legend, a former Strikeforce and Pride champion, and just overall legend of the sport. Dan Henderson making his return to 185 pounds, taking on Gegard Mousasi. And unfortunately, this fight was mired a little bit in controversy. In that many people thought, and myself included, that the fight was stopped a little bit early. Gegard clipped Dan Henderson with a punch and then went in for the kill, and the ref stopped it, even though it looked like Henderson was recovering and trying to shoot for a takedown. Now I can see how, in one sense, you have a guy who got clipped and fell backwards, but I mean, and it kind of sounds biased because I'm a Dan Henderson fan. But if you're a referee, you kind of have to do your homework and know the guys that you are reffing. And if you're taking an assignment like a Dan Henderson, you have to understand that he is a guy that gets hurt a lot but recovers very quickly, and you have to give him a chance to fight out of it. That's my opinion, and it may not be a popular one, and that may be coming from a Dan Henderson fan. But what are your thoughts on that stoppage and that fight in general?
So when I originally saw it, I saw it on a phone screen about this big because someone had it, playing. And I did not agree with it at all. Obviously, Dan didn't agree with it. I've watched it probably about 5 or 6 times since then. And as much as I hate to admit it, I think the stoppage was just. Again, people might not agree with that either. And I'm a Dan Henderson who isn't a Dan Henderson fan.
Right.
This was his time to shine. He's 44 years old. He's still got that power. But when I saw him go down, it was the way that he went down, and his arm went limp at one point. And there's a difference between the instinctual grab onto the leg, go shoot for the takedown, and you were out for a second. We've seen it hundreds of times where a fighter is completely knocked out cold, gets hit again, and he's back up and, functioning like nothing ever happened. Dan has even said, that stoppage saved his eye because of the cut or, whatever he had going. So while we might not agree with it, he still wants to fight. Do I want to keep seeing him get knocked out? Not necessarily. But, talking to fighters, the only person who's ever going to be able to tell a fighter to give up is themselves.
Yeah, very true. With that, we have 2 interesting situations here. On one hand, you have Mousasi, who jumps back into the win column and is undoubtedly a top 10, if not top 10, a top 15 middleweight in the world in the UFC. And then you have a guy like Henderson, who obviously has been struggling lately. He's getting up there in age. Be the matchmaker right now. Just off the top of your head, who would you like to see Mousasi face next? And obviously, Henderson's talking about fighting again. Who would you like to see Dan Henderson possibly go against?
Pretty interesting. I mean, because there's so much going on right now, with the makeup of that division. And I mean, I feel like Anderson not being on top has really, people have come out of the woodwork that we would not expect to be as highly rated as they are. Off the top of my head, I can't think of anybody I'd want to see Henderson face, because does he stay at 185?
I believe he said he plans on staying at 85.
So he says he plans on it, but if there's a 205 fight, I guarantee he'd probably take it in a heartbeat just because. I don't know. Who would you? I'm going to throw this one back at you. Because
no problem. I've rattled this around in my head a little bit. For Mousasi, obviously I think a top 10 guy is in order for him again. If there's not enough recovery time for that Jacare Yoel Romero fight, I easily think he could step in and take on either one of those guys. I know he just lost to Jacare, but if Romero were to need a dance partner, I could see that. I mean, otherwise, maybe a guy like the winner of the what do you call it, the CB Dollaway and Michael Bisping fight would be suitable. I mean, he just needs to stay active until he can get back in the title picture. And as for Henderson, honestly, I think he should really take one more fight with the UFC and call it. And I know we haven't seen the guy I'm going to mention in a second in a long time, but I would really, really love to see it, whether it be at a catchway 205 or 185, and that's Rich Franklin. I don't think that would ever happen in that rematch, but I would absolutely love to see that as their swan song to send both of them off into the sunset. Like I said, not sure if it could happen given that Rich Franklin works for ONE FC now as in their corporate structure, but that would be the one that I want to see both of them leave on.
You know what? I would agree with that. And from what I understand, Rich still has one fight on his contract.
Yes, I think you're right.
So I would love to see one, because they fought. They fought on the same card, I know.
No, they fought each other once.
I was going to say, so it was back in Dublin.
Right. It was they were fighting to be the Ultimate Fighter 9 coach against Michael Bisping, and then we all know what happened. Henderson won the split, and then fought Bisping as the coach and knocked him out,
Yeah,
and
who
that
who
was
could
the rest
forget
is
that?
history. Right. Exactly.
That's what I was thinking. I was like, they have fought before, so that would be a nice, have them fight at 195.
Right. Plus, it was a split decision. It was a really close fight, so I think
Yeah, it was.
you could easily make the case that a rematch would be a great way to send them both off into retirement. And I mean, Dan might not want to retire, but you may not have to give him a choice at this point. If he wants to fight somewhere else, he fights somewhere else. I made
Yeah,
the prediction at the beginning of the year that Henderson would be fighting in Bellator by the end of 2015, just because they would be interested in grabbing him. But we'll have to see.
yeah, and the whole. Uh, I'm glad you mentioned that because with the recent signing, Bellator, a few weeks ago saying, "Oh, we're interested in Mirko Krokop," whereas the UFC, it seemed to, and at least in my mind, that he wasn't even on their radar.
Right.
And I kind of feel like Bellator played a very, Scott Coker played a very nice card there because he said, "Oh, look, we're interested in Krokop," and the next thing you know, the UFC books him, re-signs him and puts him up against Gonzaga, for a rematch that happened,
I think it was
eight
07,
eight
I
years
think.
ago.
Yeah, something like that.
8 years ago. So I think that was a good play on Bellator's part if that's really what they were trying to do, to really kind of get the UFC to focus on somebody else, you
Hmm.
know, and see what they're really playing at. So,
Yeah.
you know,
No,
I
good point. Anyways, we go on to the third fight of the main card. Don't really want to spend a lot of time on this, just based on how uneventful and I think you even said you didn't even catch this fight. It was a light heavyweight bout between Phil Davis and Ryan Bader. It went to a split decision, very non-eventful fight. Both guys not really engaging too much. Bader was obviously the aggressor in the fight, and
Mhm.
would probably took the fight just based on his more effective striking. Um, the only thing I'm going to comment about this fight, and you can respond if you want to. If you're not, that's fine too. Is I can't believe Phil Davis was ever considered in the title contention spot based on his skills. He has not evolved as a fighter in the time he's been in the UFC. He's always been a wrestler with decent submission skills, but his striking has barely improved in the years he's been in the UFC. I think he is possibly one of the most overrated fighters in the company, and the fact that he still gets booked on main cards actually almost shocks me, based on A, entertainment value, and B, the way that he gets into fights. Because remember that Lyoto Machida fight that he won, I think that everyone agreed that he didn't deserve to win that. So he could almost be on like a bigger losing streak than he already is right now. So if you want to respond, please do. Otherwise, hold your peace. But
I'll, I'll only hold my peace, and I'll explain to you afterwards, pertaining to that particular situation. But I wouldn't say he's overrated. He's still got a lot going for him, and I think sharpening the tools that he does have and working on the striking more. Neither one of us are fighters, obviously. We don't do that, and luckily they do it for us, so we can be entertained. Um, but I can see that. They're still putting him on my main cards, and they're still boosting him up. When, to be honest, some of the most impressive things I've seen from Phil Davis were him beating Gustafsson back at UFC 112, and I think it was the Wagner Prado fight at 153 where he had the anaconda choke.
yeah, and then the two that you mentioned, he beat Gustafsson. That was a lot of years ago, and that was far beyond when Gustafsson was even improved. He was still a pretty raw prospect at that point, very promising, but still not nearly the fighter he is today. I think if they had a
Eh,
rematch, I think Gustafsson would take him. But and then the Wagner Prado fight, which you mentioned, Prado was a promising prospect that didn't really work out too well. Got beat by a welterweight in his pink slip match, as I like to call it. So again, I've never been really overly impressed with Phil Davis. I think he's a phenomenal athlete, and I think his wrestling is almost second to none. But guys are just game planning him so well now that they're beating him. Anthony Johnson sprawled and brawled him, and he couldn't take down Ryan Bader, a guy that he beat in amateur wrestling. So I just don't see the value in him. He's a good mid carder that you put on a free card, maybe a Fox Sports card. But at this point, I just don't see much in him. He's not improving the way he should. Guys, some of the jiu-jitsu guys who have improved their like think about Fabricio Verdum a few years ago. Still wasn't a great striker. Was basically a jiu-jitsu guy, and now you look at him now and he's knocking out Mark Hunt with a knee.
Yeah,
So there's guys that are improving, and then there's guys like Phil Davis who are still very one-dimensional.
yeah, and if he ever sees this, he probably won't be so happy. But
You know
We
what?
we
That's
got.
fine. He can make fun of my job all he wants, and how my performance is, and that's that's his opinion. This is my opinion, and I've always kind of thought this way, but it's kind of coming more salient now that he's taking on top competition. He's not taking on guys at the bottom of the card.
Well, I mean,
Last, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no, I was gonna say, that being said, with him losing to Bader, where does that put him now in the picture? Because that still leaves him in all aspects as a top 10 light heavyweight.
Yeah, he's in a pretty interesting position. I take a look at the roster. I actually keep a personal ranking system on my computer, and you're right, he still is top 10. But if you think about it, the light heavyweight division is very shallow in terms of top end talent, and it's a very old division. I look throughout the ranks. Rashad Evans is probably past his prime at this point, though I do still think he is a top fighter. Antonio Rogerio Nogueira has not been the same in years. Another guy that's aging. Shogun Hua, Rampage Jackson. These are all guys that are way past their prime, but they're still in the top end of the division because it's a division that is just lacking depth, and I think that's why Davis has stayed afloat for so long. Where he goes from here, it's probably going to be another mid-carder guy, taking on a guy like, I don't know, like a Ryan Jimmo or anything like that in the mid-card just to keep him in the picture and get him a win. That's my opinion, but I mean, now that I mentioned that, where do you think Ryan Bader goes from here?
I mean, I think Ryan Bader is gonna. I don't want to say he's gonna sit out, but he's gonna really see how the rest of this division, comes together. He could, by all intents and purposes, he could end up getting paired up with DC.
Yeah,
Who knows?
yeah, you're right, and like you said, and like I said earlier, the lack of depth. He could be taking on a guy that's coming off of a loss, or he could take on a guy in the mid card. You never know, just to keep him busy. But I think so. One of the first things I thought of was Rashad Evans. I thought that'd be an interesting matchup, but I believe that the UFC is still imminent on putting Evans with Glover Teixeira, so it really leaves him with not a lot of options. Maybe
Well, I know that fight got scrapped for a knee injury. I believe it was Glover, and they replaced that as they replaced Frank Mir and Bigfoot as the main card on that one. So now we've got Rashad sitting in limbo yet again. And to be honest, to touch on the Phil Davis thing one more time, now that we see that Rampage is going to be paired up with Maldonado, I think Rampage and Phil Davis could be an interesting fight.
At this point in the game, I don't know about that. Rampage hasn't traditionally done great against wrestlers in recent times.
Well, good for Phil Davis, bad for Rampage.
Exactly. It would be a good matchup for him, not Rampage. And I don't think they'd do that considering they just re-signed him.
Yeah.
Just to kind of keep things rolling here, we got to talk about the last main card bout before we talk about our prelims of the night. It was a featherweight bout between Akira Corisani and Sam Sicilia. That was another one that ended in vicious knockout form, this time in the form of Sam Sicilia knocking out Akira Corisani. I believe you said you saw this fight.
Yes.
I only saw the highlights, the finish. But from what I saw, Sam Sicilia looked like he improved his striking a little bit. I mean, Akira Corisani is a stand-up guy, and he was put down pretty harshly. And actually retired after the fight because he's taken so much damage in the last few UFC fights he has. So obviously we commend him for that. Obviously mental health and physical health come before anything else. So best of luck to him. What did you think of the knockout? What did you think of the stoppage? Did you think it was too late? I personally thought it was a good stoppage, and the ref got there when he could. But Sicilia obviously doing his job, finishing him off once he gets him hurt.
Well, and that was the other thing. I mean, everyone talked about the overhand right, and I was like, nobody talked about the beautiful left uppercut he threw, in between, a couple of hooks that really, if anything, that was what did it, and the overhand right was just the finishing touch.
Right.
Because he was out cold. There's no doubt in my mind, the one extra punch, it happens every now and then, and, you don't want to be that fighter who stops fighting and realizes the fight isn't over.
Yep.
And I always go back to the, Paul Harris and Dan Miller when he's up on top of the cage and Herb Dean was like, get down, the fight's not over.
Yeah.
There's one thing with fighter safety, but at the same time, until that ref stops you, you got to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Obviously, you don't want to do it like you said, but you really do have to put him down for good, if you want to win the fight.
Hmm.
Sam Sicilia has really been an inconsistent enigma. He's winning fights that, maybe he's not supposed to, and then he's losing fights that possibly he should win.
Hmm.
Obviously he saved his job with this one, and
Yeah.
will be interesting to see where he goes from here because he has been a very consistent bottom of the mid-low card guy in the featherweight division. All right, going to the prelims, the preferred prelims, we have. Well, I'll ask you first. What was the prelim that you wanted that stood out in your mind?
Well, I mean, of the prelims that I was able to watch, seeing Andy Ogle get taken down by that flying knee, that was it was. I want to say it's almost reminiscent of seeing Aldo do it to Cub Swanson. Aldo's was much prettier and much more devastating. Um, but still, to see a guy, burst out into the scene and start a fight off like that, um, you know, Americani just it was insane.
Yeah, absolutely. And it wasn't even only the flying knee. I think he kind of only grazed him with the flying knee. It was a follow-up. I think it was a left uppercut that
Hmm.
was really the one that put Ogle down, and it was actually a beautiful play for a guy who's never had a knockout in his career, and he got one in 8 seconds because Amir Khani is a fantastic grappler. And, not much has been talked about his striking because, he is kind of basic in that. He kind of just fired out of the gates and took Ogle by surprise. The prelim I wanted to talk about was also a knockout finish. It was Kenny Robertson's knockout of Sultan Aliyev. Did you actually catch that knockout or no?
I didn't get to see that one, no.
Okay. Yeah, it was a great counter strike. Sultan Aliyev threw a spinning kick, and Robertson sidestepped it and nailed him with a beautiful punch, and put him down and finished him off on the ground, and put him out, and that was very impressive. I've always been very high on Kenny Robertson as a fighter, but even I had Sultan Aliyev winning this fight. Sultan's a great, ground technician, very powerful guy. If you take a look at him, he's absolutely shredded, strong, and has a lot of knockouts on his record. And, he made one mistake. He threw a very errant spin kick, and Kenny
Hmm.
Robertson took advantage of it. And Kenny Robertson continues to be kind of almost not the king of the mid card, but a guy that is very, very prominent in the mid card scene of the UFC welterweight division. So I was
Hmm.
very impressed with that stoppage, and we'll see where he goes from here. I think he's a very good guy that's constantly improving. Um, Other than that, there were a lot of stoppages on the cards. There were a few decisions. So from that, we go from UFC on Fox taking place from Las Vegas. We're going to get some quick picks in here. We'll give a quick breakdown and predict our winners here. The main event, Anderson Silva versus Nick Diaz in a middleweight super fight, if you will. Anderson Silva returning for the first time since gruesomely breaking his leg against Chris Weidman back in December of 2013.
Yeah,
2013.
2013.
So, yeah, it was. I'm almost thrown off a little bit. So, what is your breakdown of this fight, and what will your pick be for this one, Matt?
So, you know, having this card coming up and really thinking about it, I mean, it's an interesting matchup because, to be completely honest, the last thing I want to see is them box each other. I kind of think that this is going to be a ground fight. I think this is Nick Diaz's chance to show that his jiu-jitsu and that his ground game is better than the Anderson Silva's. And I would not be surprised if he tries that. I know it's kind of a crazy idea, but I think it would make for an exciting fight.
So, who do you have in this one?
I don't even want to say.
You don't
I
even want to
mean,
take a pick?
I don't because this is a matchup that a few years ago I think would have had a lot more on it, and I think now more eyes are on it, not because of the matchup, but to see if Anderson's gonna, be able to recover from that, gruesome, leg break.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if I had to pick somebody, I'm gonna take, greatest of all time, Anderson Silva.
Yeah, fair enough. And you alluded to this. You don't want to see a boxing match, but I think that's exactly what you're going to see. Nick Diaz knows what the fans want. I think he wants to prove to himself that he can strike with a legend like Silva. I think this was a tailor-made matchup by the UFC because they know Anderson's not going to have to kick a lot in this fight. He might, just knowing that Diaz's kryptonite is leg kicks, but he doesn't have to try and outbox Diaz. With the head movement and the overall athleticism in the ring and his movement, he's so fluid that I think he's going to be able to do it without throwing many kicks. So Diaz is known for having an absolute steel chin, but I do think Anderson Silva will find a way to finish him with some sort of flurry and finish on the ground after he drops him. Moving on to the co-main event, we take a look. We have a welterweight showdown, which could determine a future title contender. We have the Ultimate Fighter season 17 winner, Kelvin Gastelum, who is undefeated in the UFC, taking on Tyron Woodley. Your thoughts on that match, Matt?
Well, I mean, Gastelum has just really. I remember watching the show, and when he was put up against Uriah Hall, I said, "There's no way this kid wins," and he pulled it out, and he's done nothing but impress since. He really, has taken a shine to it, and I feel like Woodley has his ups and downs. He'll perform really well for a fight, get a quick knockout, and then he'll have a lackluster fight, and it just doesn't seem like the consistency's saying. That being said, if Gastelum can watch out for the power that Woodley possesses, I think he can take this fight, and what's more than likely he's going to be the underdog.
Yeah, I would agree with that. He's definitely the underdog, but I also like Gastelum in this fight, and the reason is because I think that Tyron Woodley's gas tank is too suspect at this point, and I know Gastelum's not exactly a marathon runner in his own right, but I think that he is better than that. And the one fight that I always kind of point to, which maybe it's too long ago, but it's always in my mind because I saw it live, was when Tyron Woodley fought Paul Daly and was almost actually out-grappled by Paul Daly because he got tired in the fight.
So going way back.
Yes, and I know but it's always stuck with me for some reason. So I think if Gastelum can stay away from the power shot and the power punch, which he totally is capable of doing, he did it with Jake Ellenberger and effectively beat him quickly. I think Gastelum can run a very, very convincing decision, and who knows, he could jump into the title picture. Dana White even said himself that a win could get him in there. There's
I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, and if you look at it, I mean, there's a lot of guys in the title picture right now between your Johnny Hendricks, your Hector Lombard, your Rory McDonald, but Kelvin can totally throw his name in the hat and screw that all up.
And I think what would be nice about Kelvin is he's a new face. He's getting, we're moving away from hopefully rematch after rematch after rematch, so on and so forth.
Yeah, totally, and that's another selling point with him. We move to the third fight on the main card, a fight that I would have had on the prelims in favor of Ian McCall versus John Lineker, but it's a lightweight bout between Joe Lauzon and Al Iaquinta. I will start off on this one. I think this fight made it on the main card, just based on entertainment value. Both guys are extremely entertaining. They're both very skilled, and they're both probably top 30 lightweights in the world right now. Al, I think at this point has more tools than Joe Lauzon between his footwork and his wrestling, and I do think he has more technical boxing. I think he has too many tools to fail here, and I think Joe Lauzon's a little bit past his prime. So in this fight, I could really see Al Iaquinta kind of dominating in the way that Michael Johnson did to Joe Lauzon not long ago.
Yeah, and I mean, that fight being a year and a half ago, you're talking about the fight with Johnson.
Yeah.
I like Joe Lauzon, and I think you're absolutely right. I think entertainment value is why this fight made it on the main card. Surprisingly, over Miesha Tate, and like you said, Ian McCall's fight with Lineker. But I would agree, Al Iaquinta has shown vast improvements over his last few fights, and I think it's time for him to put another notch in his belt, and I think he'll come out with the win on this one.
So we're both in agreement on Iaquinta. With that, we move to the middleweight division. Kind of an interesting matchup. It's a Tim the Barbarian Boach, who is for some reason one of my folk heroes in terms of MMA. I don't know why I like him so much. Taking on a resurgent Talis Leites, who has looked very, very good since returning to the UFC. Yeah. Vastly improved. A guy who probably should have never been cut from the UFC to begin with. I thought that was kind of a crap deal. So what is your view on this fight, Matt?
I like Tim Bosch as well, but I think Leites is just riding too much steam going into this fight. I mean, he's finished guys that hadn't been finished before, hadn't been finished in a while, and I mean, he just looks ever improving every single fight. And I mean, Bosch is kind of having mixed results, his past few outings, and I don't want to go as far to say I'd love to see Leites fight Anderson Silva again. But I'll throw it out there just because, they're two completely different fighters than they were that first time they met. And, I think Leites comes out with a win on this one for sure.
I will take a differing view, and it's not because I'm a Tim Boach fan. The reason I think is going to be
Sure.
the counter wrestling. I don't think that Taylor's Ladies has the takedowns to get Tim Boach down, and when they stay on the feet, I think Boach is just too powerful and too aggressive for Ladies to get anything started. From a tactical standpoint, I do think Boach does have an advantage in this fight, and he's won fights where he's getting his butt kicked and he comes back. I can cite the Yushin Okami fight and the Brad Tavares fight where he has heart for days and he will come back. And he will always be in that fight, and he always has that capability of ending a fight in one strike. So I don't think he will finish Talis Ladies, but I do think he will get the victory in a very, very workmanlike setting because it won't be an easy fight.
No. Give me one
Uh,
second. I'm just going to grab something. So.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. I will do the intro for the last fight on the main card. It is a welterweight bout between Canadian Jordan Meehan against returning Brazilian Thiago Alves. Now, Alves has been out of action a lot due to injuries in the past few years, has not been able to stay very active, and he's taking on a young Canadian guy in Meehan who has been very, very impressive in both Strikeforce and the UFC. Both guys are strikers. Although when it comes to the ground game, I would definitely give Jordan Meehan the advantage. That said, Alves does have good takedown defense. So when it comes to this fight, I think it comes down to who is more aggressive, who takes the center of the cage, and who uses their striking more effectively. And that's a really tough one to call because both guys are very good kickboxers. I think that Thiago Alves is his leg kicks and his ability to kind of wear guys down by kicking their legs and mixing it up to the body is what might get him the victory here. But, ring rust is definitely a question mark, which does make this one of the more difficult fights of the night to pick. So what is your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, Alves did look pretty good in his last outing, especially after all that time off. And I feel like, to be honest, I feel like Alves was never the same after he fought George St. Pierre. I really don't.
A lot of men weren't.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, I was actually at the UFC on Fox because that one was in Orlando when he fought Seth Baczynski.
Right.
I mean, it wasn't the most exciting fight, but it was nice to see him back in the cage. That being said, Jordan Mine, at one time, people were saying this is going to be, the dark horse in the division. He's going to be the guy to, look out for. And if you look at his record, I mean, up until he ran into Matt Brown, he was doing pretty well.
Yep.
So, that being said, they both Alves and Mine fought on that same card in Orlando. And, now I think it's Mine's time to shine, given, Alves doesn't have that extra ring rust. I know it's crazy, and, Mine beat, a friend of mine in Mike Piles, so
Yep.
it's hard to say on that one.
All right. Well, looks like we have a lot of the same picks on the main card, maybe a little bit of a differential on in there. Just taking a look at the prelim cards, what is the fight you are most looking forward to on the undercard?
Ian McCall.
The Ian McCall-John Lineker fight was also the one I picked, but just to give some differing view, I will be looking forward to the Miesha Tate-Sarah McMahon fight. I want to see if McMahon can step up that competition and take on a fellow wrestler, although her wrestling is at a higher level. Can she strike with Miesha Tate, who obviously hasn't improved her striking a lot? With that said, I want to quickly jump into a new segment that we're going to be doing. It's on the regional MMA fight of the week. It is a CES 27 fight, which is actually a pretty stacked card of East Coast talent, which will be headlined by the Ultimate Fighter, I think it was Ultimate Fighter 13 alumni, Chuck O'Neal, fighting for the CES, I believe, welterweight title against Emmanuel Wallow. Now, man, I'm not sure how familiar you are with Chuck O'Neal's work or his recent work, but what are your thoughts on him as a fighter and this fight against Emmanuel Wallow for the CES title?
I mean, it's hard to say because unless you're really meticulous and you're watching, most fighters once they leave the UFC, they're out of sight, out of mind to most fans. It really is that way. I like Chuck O'Neal on the show. I think he has potential, and this is a way for him to make his way back because that's what every fighter seems to want. Every fighter who has left the UFC in one way or another wants to go home. And I think this is a chance. Not knowing much about his opponent, it's hard to say what he's going to run into.
Yeah, Wallow is a fighter that is a little bit over 500. Has fought mostly in the East Coast regional scene, but since the Ultimate Fighter, I think Chuck O'Neal has been pretty improved. He's always been a tough, gritty guy that is going to go out there and give you his all. But since the UFC, he's put together some nice wins. He's had a loss or two in that time, but you talk about he beat Marcus Davis at one point, UFC veteran Marcus Davis,
Hmm.
and it looks like he is improving. And he was a guy that I really liked on that season, and I would eventually like to see him back in the octagon to see how much he has improved. And maybe this is his stepping stone back into the UFC. Yeah, I am definitely looking forward. I think CES has an awesome show. I believe they will be on Go Fight Live, but I'm not 100% sure. It might actually be on Access TV, so check your local listings for that. Um, then the other card, the other fight on there that I'd like to see, although Let Me Bang Bro Julian Lane from the Ultimate Fighter is on that card, I could care less about that fight, is a guy who I believe has been training with the Black Zillions in your neck of the woods by the name of Andre Sukamtath, who originally fought in New England but moved to Florida. He will be competing on the card, I believe, against Brian Kelleher, and he's a prospect in my eyes to watch. So if you guys get a chance to watch CES, keep an eye out for him and obviously the main event between Chuck O'Neal.
And it's funny that you kind of brought up your local card because speaking of Ultimate Fighter alumni, the FCF card that's going on in Orlando on Friday has Clayton McKinney. So we're
Right,
going,
you're right. Yes, and we haven't seen him in a long time. I don't think he's been staying very active. I think he had some injuries and stuff. So I'm actually, yeah, I was keeping an eye on that. It's also headlined by Julian Williams.
hmm Yeah,
Yeah,
so it's going to be interesting because I mean, there's guys on this card that just fought on the World Series of Fighting card,
yeah,
just
you're
two
right.
months ago.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. That's another good regional one. If you're in the area, obviously, or you can find a way to watch that somehow, that's another good card to watch this weekend as well. And then obviously there's some other ones too that we're not going to touch on because we don't have a lot of time. But NAAFS, which is out of Ohio, would be another great card to watch this weekend as well. Always good regional stuff going on.
Yeah,
Now,
I definitely am a big supporter of the local ones, and there's a few guys on this card that I will guarantee will be in the UFC, Bellator, World Series. They'll be there one day, absolutely.
awesome insight from Mr. Quiggins. Now, we are going to talk to the only news item we have before I close the show out with a Wrestling Minute, which was a tradition of this show. The UFC, or I'm sorry, the Invicta card will be announced the day before UFC 184 in the same city of Los Angeles that Ronda Rousey and Kat Zingano are competing on in the co-main event. Ironically enough, the main event will be between Chris Cyborg and her opponent Charmaine Tweet. Now, what are your thoughts on the placement and timing of this fight in comparison to the UFC card and what implications there might be?
I would not be surprised if there's a clause that says, Cyborg wins, she's got the UFC contract. I'd love to see her be able to make the weight. I think she can, and I think it's just a matter of, I don't think it's her ducking. At one point she said it was medically unable, and then she said she made it. But, even Shannon Nappis said, everybody knows the UFC is interested. Everybody wants to see Cyborg versus Ronda because that'll be the ultimate test for Ronda. It really will. I think the placement of the card is exactly that. They want people to watch that fight, watch Ronda fight, and if the two of them are victorious, they have the perfect, setup to book that fight.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. The issue I do have is I really don't think that Cyborg can make the weight, and I think she's admitted recently that she doesn't think she can make the weight either. She did have a test cut, and I believe that she didn't make it at least safely. So I don't know if that's a fight they can make, but the ironic thing is they do have this fight. She is defending her featherweight title against Charmaine Tweed, who is a girl we really can't count out, despite the fact she is fighting possibly the greatest female fighter of all time for now in Chris Cyborg. But she's been such a destruction machine. It's really hard to vote against her. But I really just don't think she can make it. She is a very big girl. She is very muscular. She is very lean. There's not a lot to cut off there to make the extra 10 pounds she's going to have to cut. But it is an exciting card. For you women's MMA fans out there, the co-main event is a strawweight bout between Mizuki Inoue, who is only 20 years old, and in my opinion, the future of the strawweight division, considering she gets better than she already is, taking on Alexa Grasso, a Mexican prospect who is undefeated at this point, and an absolute beast on the feet. If you saw her last fight, she knocked out Alita Gray in under 2 minutes, and that is a very hard feat because Alita Gray is a power puncher in her own right. The other big fight on that card is a strawweight bout in which Deanna Bennett will drop from flyweight to make 115 to fight Lynn Alvarez, a good veteran of the sport. And it will be very interesting to see how Bennett does on the weight cut, considering she has fought at bantamweight in the past, beating women like Colleen Schneider and Juliana Pena, who won the Ultimate Fighter. And then she went back down to 125, which I thought was her natural weight class. She's not a small 25er, but she will now be trying to make 115, and will be very interesting to see. Do you have any thoughts on those fights, Matt?
None that I could think of, besides the fact that, obviously Lynn Alvarez, if I'm not mistaken, has, some fighting family, if you want to call it that.
Who's that?
Oh, the last thing I had seen on it, I don't know if it was true. It said it was Eddie Alvarez's wife, which I don't
think that's the case, actually. I don't know where you saw that, but I do not believe that to be the case.
You can't believe everything you see on the internet.
That is true. The internet has fooled me a few times.
I'm excited for the Alexa Grasso fight just because, I saw that fight against Alita Gray, and she looked just phenomenal. So I'm pretty excited about that. Just any of the Invicta cards, really. They've produced some top talent. If you look, obviously the UFC's roster is made up of 95% of Invicta's, crossovers, or, people that they've been interested in at some point. Obviously with the Ultimate Fighter this last season, kind of, there was a lot. So anytime the Invicta comes on and I get a chance, I'll make the time to watch it.
Yeah, and again, that's a fight I'm also looking forward to. Also on the card, just some random names. Another fellow Mexican striker, Irene Aldana, will be competing on the card, as well as some top prospects who you may not know about. Jamie Moyle, who I saw live in Iowa when I was covering the Invicta fight. She is very, very good for a 1-0 pro. Brianna Van Buren, who has not been in action for a little bit. Christine Stanley, who is famous for her spinning wheel kick knockout that was circulating YouTube recently. And then Christy Lopez, a lesser-known fighter from California that's going to get a chance to kick the card off on the prelims and show what she's made of. She's a 10th Planet Jiu-Jitsu fighter training under Eddie Bravo. So, she's also a prospect to keep your eye on.
Well, then you have, J.J. Aldridge, and the only reason I'm going to bring that up is because she defeated a friend of mine in Delaney Owen on that last
fight. Yeah, and she's a great prospect, too.
So that was definitely interesting to... it's interesting to see all these women just coming out of the woodwork.
Yeah, and actually, it's funny you bring that up, that Aldrich fight. I was very surprised because I was very, very high on Delaney O. I still am very high on Delaney O, and the way she beat her was very surprising to me because I didn't know a lot about Aldrich, and I knew a little bit about Owen and how she was tearing through that SCS organization and how she won, I believe it was 2 title belts there. And, so Aldrich, she's taking on Jamie Moyle, who's no joke. She just beat up Jenny Lou Shriver, who was a girl that almost made the Ultimate Fighter. So that shows you how legit Jamie Moyle is as well. So that should be a good prospect matchup of 1-0 fighters. Before we leave, I'm going to do the traditional wrestling minute here by myself. I don't have my old partner for this, but we'll close the show on it anyways. The only thing I'm going to talk about today is the Royal Rumble that took place on Sunday from Philadelphia. Overall, a very hit-or-miss card. They had, I think it was I think every match was a tag team match minus the World Heavyweight Championship fight. The Ascension defeated the New Age Outlaws. There was nothing special there, although it was cool to see the New Age Outlaws back in action. There was a women's tag team match that I went to the bathroom for because I didn't care to see it. The Miz versus the Usos match was the only entertaining because Sandow is possibly the funniest person in wrestling at this point. But, the World Heavyweight Championship triple threat match was amazing. And if you noticed, they didn't have a Raw last night because of the winter storms, so they re-showed that match on USA. So if you were not fortunate enough to watch the pay-per-view on Sunday, you got to watch it for free on USA, and it was one that you couldn't miss. I thought the guy who performed his butt off and really made the match was Seth Rollins. He was bumping hard for everybody. He was doing some crazy spots. He pulled off the 450 Phoenix Splash from the top rope. He did the turnbuckle to the Spanish announce table spot where he threw an elbow through Lesnar, which looked legitimately painful on both parts. And obviously Lesnar looked great as usual. Lesnar's always been a good performer in the ring, and even Cena, a guy that I always criticize, I thought that he did a very good part in the match. Was very sympathetic the way he was getting beat up by Lesnar. So I thought the World Heavyweight Championship match is a very early contender for match of the year in the wrestling world. But then you had the Rumble match, and Matt, I don't know if did you watch the Royal Rumble at all? No.
So I caught, what I thought was Raw last night, and it was the Royal Rumble, and I watched wrestling growing up, WCW, watching Sting body slam the Giant, all that stuff, and I've watched the progression over the years, and I've never seen a crowd boo as much as they did during that. And when The Rock's out there and people boo, it's not good for business.
Yeah, you know what? And they did the same thing happened last year in the Royal Rumble when Daniel Bryan was not entered into the Royal Rumble. The fans hijacked the show, and it really ruined the rest of the Royal Rumble. I don't know how the bookers didn't see this coming. If you want to let Roman Reigns win the Royal Rumble, totally fine. I'm fine with that decision myself. I actually like Roman Reigns. I think he's improving. I don't think he's quite ready, but I do think that he is very, very promising, and he could be that guy in the future. Because he does have some natural charisma, but they have to let him be himself, much like his cousin The Rock was let to be himself. But the major problem was having Daniel Bryan eliminated that early. I don't know what they were thinking or what was going to happen. If you eliminate him in the final four, that doesn't drag down the rest of the show, because once Bryan was eliminated, I think I heard 3 pops the rest of the night. The first one was Dean Ambrose. Actually, no, I take that back. There were 4 pops, but they were very brief. When Mizdow made it back in, but he was only in for 10 seconds, so they immediately turned back on him. The Dean Ambrose one, which wasn't even as big as usual because the fans were so upset. Dolph Ziggler, who again was again eliminated very quickly, and the fans were upset. And The Rock, again, there was an initial pop, but eventually they just turned on him as well. Yeah. So I think if you eliminate
having Rusev come out from under the ring, I did see that. So it's like having that just at the end. It almost felt like a last-ditch effort to save it, and it just, I'm not a diehard fan, but that didn't do it for me.
I think that spot would have worked had the fans not been totally disheveled by the end of the show, because, and you could even hear the crowd chanting for Rusev, they were actually at that point where, we will take him over Reigns, much the way that it happened last year when it was Batista and Reigns, and everyone knew Batista was going to win, and they were chanting for Roman Reigns to win. So it's kind of a funny ironic there, because the same thing that happened with Batista while Reigns was getting cheered on happened to Reigns this year in favor of Rusev. But again, when you eliminate, I think he was only in the match, Bryan, for about 10 minutes, and he was gone, and the fans were absolutely livid after that. Mm-hmm. So I don't think they would have hijacked the show and turned on it as horribly as they did had they not eliminated them that quickly. I also didn't like the finish with having the last 3 guys, other than Rusev, being Big Show, Kane, and Reigns. I know what they're trying to do there to show Reigns overcome 2 opponents at once, but it's almost like you didn't trust your young guys to finish the match out. I think they should have kept Bray Wyatt in the final 4. They made him look so strong, and I don't mind them taking him out, but having him out in favor of the Big Show and Kane, they unceremoniously eliminated so many guys at the end of the match. They just basically knocked them out, picked them up, and dumped them over. They did that with Ziggler. They did that with Wyatt. They did that with Dean Ambrose, and that also was very anticlimactic, and it made the match almost unwatchable. It was
when I caught it, not realizing what it was initially, watching Big Show and Kane, try to push him over. It was so anticlimactic. You're right. Kane is going to be 50 in a couple years here.
Right.
He's still got the talent, but you're right. They should have let that show rest on the young guns. And it's to throw this in really quick, it's exactly what MMA is doing. They're bringing in the guys that everybody knows. Bringing back these guys to get people in, and not trusting it to bringing in guys like Kimbo and Rampage to Bellator. When you've got guys like, Michael Chandler, you've got, Will Brooks, all these guys, Daniel Strauss, Pitbull, who could carry Bellator.
Yeah, no, you're right, and you're right. I've noticed the same thing. But sometimes it's we need ratings now. We need ratings now, and they don't realize that you're hurting your ratings down the line because you're not creating new stars. And WWE absolutely has the tools, and just like the UFC has the tools, they have the tools to make stars of the near future. And they've done it very well with Roman Reigns. I think they've done it very well with Seth Rollins. He has easily become the top heel in the company in a very short amount of time. This
Absolutely.
was a guy that was getting huge pops because he was putting on amazing matches. Then he turns heel, and he's the top heel in the company because he's working his ass off. They're relying on guys like Triple H and The Rock and Brock Lesnar when they have, Bray Wyatt and Rusev and all these other guys that really can be stars. And even guys like Cena and Orton need to kind of step to the side a little bit as well and let that happen because, sure, they're making their money, but the company's going to get hurt down the line if they don't get out of the way and let some of the other younger guys kind of take the spotlight. I would love to see a year where Cena was not in the title picture at all, just to see how it happens. Not in the main event ever either, because when CM Punk was the champion, how many times did he main event over John Cena? Very rarely, unless Cena was in the match. So I think that's the one problem, and the Royal Rumble kind of just continues to show that that's how it's happening. And if you look forward to WrestleMania, you look at the top matches already. I mean, Rusev and Cena is one of the matches that they're having, which is fine. I think that's a very suitable match. It keeps Cena away from the title. But then you got Lesnar, who's a part-timer, taking on Reigns for the title. Not a huge deal. But then you have Triple H versus Sting, and it's like that doesn't do much for me. I mean, the storyline it works for me, but I was never a huge Triple H fan, and Sting isn't what he used to be. He was never the greatest technical wrestler, but so they need to have a WrestleMania, and I honestly think that Seth Rollins could be the top heel in a WrestleMania main event at this point. And Dolph Ziggler has come into his own, and Damian Sandow can be a star based on the pops he gets. And Dean Ambrose has been booked horribly, but still manages to get himself over because he's so good at what he does. So that was a little bit more than a wrestling minute, but.
Yeah.
But I mean that just kind of signified the problems. Although I did kind of catch some of the Raw last night. I did like that different format where they just did a lot of heart-to-heart interviews, and then they replayed the pay-per-view. It was kind of a nice change-up, and to the creative fiascos they always have and the questionable booking. So I know that, like I said, that was a little more than a wrestling minute, but sometimes I go off on a tangent. Anything else you want to add before I sign off here, Mr. Quiggins?
Anything else I don't know. I kind of wanted to touch on the Ian McCall-Lineker fight because that's something that's bothered me, especially because considering the implications that has for, a trilogy fight for McCall if he's victorious, or the fact that, seeing, Lineker's, issues with his weight and this fight being rebooked, and to put this card, put this fight on the prelims, nearly at the bottom of the prelims, and putting, like you said, the Lozon and Quinta fight, like it, you feel like, I'm not going to say who said this, so we're just going to go with that. The UFC does not like the flyweight division.
No.
They don't like their champion, and it's not anything personal, but Demetrius does not have that same. If a Johnson, if there's a flyweight title fight on a card, I haven't been excited about one in quite some time, and Johnson has his flashes of brilliance, and I'm not taking anything away. He is an amazing fighter, but he doesn't have the personality of a UFC champion.
No, I agree with you, and you're right. I think the last Johnson fight that I was really excited for was the John Dodson fight because they matched speed for speed, and that was the best fight I think he's had as champion.
As champion, yeah.
Yeah, and no, you're absolutely right, and I've been bitching about it on Twitter, and anybody that'll listen to me about MMA talk, I think that the Lineker-McCall fight not making the main card is a travesty and it's bullshit, and it really is, in my view, it is the top contenders fight. Whoever wins this fight, assuming Lineker makes weight, is fighting Demetrius Johnson for the title because that's pretty much the only contender outside of Kyoji Horiguchi, who is probably not ready at this point, but very close.
And I will say, with the exception of the Dodson fight, I think the fighter who has pushed Demetrius the hardest and, really put him in trouble was McCall, that first time around.
Yeah, I totally agree with that too. I think he's a very not a bad stylistic matchup, but a very competitive stylistic matchup for Demetrius.
And the second fight they had, McCall had a really bad weight cut.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he was walking around at almost 160 pounds, and cut to weight that flyweight limit. So, along with some personal things in his life, which everybody knows about now, he really had a lot going on. And I think McCall wins this fight. He uses his footwork. And he's going to frustrate Lineker the same way he did with Pickett. You can accuse him of running, but to be honest, a fight is a fight. You win however you have to. but there's a difference between running from a fighter and using your footwork effectively to make sure that that fighter doesn't knock you out.
I agree, and that's why I'm a huge fan of McCall. The footwork, the excellent, the leg kicks, and the way he moves around the cage. So I
And
actually am glad that you brought that up because I did want to touch on it, and I kind of just forgot as we went along there.
it's all
All
right.
right, I think that's about it here. We've gone about an hour or so here talking some MMA, a little wrestling at the end. As always, we want to thank Combat Press for giving us the platform here to talk our views here. Check them out on
Absolutely.
Twitter at Combat Press. Also, check out the website combatpress.com for your latest interviews, news stories, editorials, and everything in the world of MMA. Follow me on Twitter. I'm still not at 1 million followers yet, and I'm kind of getting annoyed by it. Big Riles at Big Riles MMA. That is Big Riles MMA. Mr. Quiggins, do you have a Twitter handle that you'd like to plug here?
I do, and it's nice and simple. It's at Quiggins MMA, and it's Quiggins MMA. Nice and simple, short, sweet, and to the point.
Awesome. Please follow Mr. Quiggins on MMA. I plan on doing it after the show myself. Also, just going to give myself a shameless plug here. Keep up to date on my Bleacher Report page, as that is one of the other ways that I get my MMA views out in the world. I'm currently in the middle of a best prospect series that the UFC should sign. Starting all the way from heavyweight and making my way down to the women's divisions. There's 2 days left. I'm doing a flyweight version tomorrow and then a women's one on Thursday, so keep a lookout for that as well as breaking news articles for both Combat Press and Bleacher Report, as well as my monthly women's MMA rankings that come out the first week of each month. We will have one coming out, obviously, if not the end of the week, next week, so keep a lookout for that. All right, that's going to do it for us tonight. Take care, and maybe you'll see us again next weekend if my hosting duties were done correctly tonight. So have a good one and enjoy your Wednesday.
Have a